The thermometer outside Coldwater Flats General Store read 104 degrees at 9 o'clock in the morning, and nobody thought that was unusual for a July in Montana. The heat came down flat and heavy, the kind that pressed the color out of the sky and turned the dust in the street to something closer to powder than dirt. Horses at the hitching posts stood with their heads low. Dogs had found whatever shade existed and stayed there. Even the flies moved slowly. The town had turned out anyway. Not because they were required to, because they wanted to see. May Collier stood at the gate of the Coldwater Flats Community Church in a brown cotton dress that had been let out twice at the seams and washed so many times the shoulders had gone pale. She had sewn the alterations herself by lamplight, her needle moving through the fabric the same way it moved through everything, quietly, steadily, without complaint. She had pinned her dark hair back from her face. She had not looked in the mirror longer than it took to confirm that nothing was visibly wrong. There was no point in lingering. She was 34 years old. She had buried a husband. She had buried a child. She had spent 4 months living on credit at Edna Greer's boarding house, eating what was offered and saying thank you each time because pride was a luxury that required resources she no longer had. She had worn the shape of other people's pity like a second skin for long enough that she had learned to move inside it without letting it slow her down. The town council had read her name 3 days earlier, at the weekly meeting in the same flat tone they used to record the sale of livestock or the transfer of a land deed. May Collier, widow, no income, no property, no family remaining within 3 counties. A problem requiring a practical solution. The council had been very pleased with their own efficiency. She had not been asked. She had not expected to be. She put her hand on the gate latch and pushed it open. She heard it before she had taken 2 steps into the churchyard. Not one voice. Several. The particular layered sound of people speaking at a volume calculated to carry, without appearing to be aimed, the social art of the public whisper, practiced by people who have never had reason to imagine themselves as the subject. Lord, look at the size of her. Poor Eli Danner. His leg already ruined, and now this. She buried one husband already. Wonder what she did with him. Laughter. Not mean laughter exactly. Comfortable laughter. The laughter of people who have arranged themselves on the safe side of something and have forgotten what the other side feels like. May kept walking. Her chin stayed level. Her hands stayed still at her sides. She had learned this years ago in rooms that required it, that stillness was armor, and breaking stride was surrender. She had not survived 3 years of widowhood and 4 months of charity by giving ground every time someone needed her to be smaller than she was. She was almost to the church steps when the voice cut across the yard, hard, low, not raised for effect, raised because the man speaking meant every syllable and saw no reason to soften them. Anybody got something to say it to my face. The laughter stopped. May looked up. He was standing at the far side of the churchyard beside a wagon that hadn't been cleaned since winter. Tall and sun-darkened, with a jaw set in the particular way of a man who has asked a question he is fully prepared to follow through on. His hat was pulled low against the morning glare. He was leaning slightly, not dramatically, not making a performance of it, just the natural adjustment of a man who had spent 2 years learning to distribute his weight differently after one leg decided it could no longer be relied upon completely. Eli Danner. He was not looking at May. He was looking at the men by the fence posts, the ones who had been smiling. The smiles were gone now. They had taken one look at Eli Danner's expression and decided that whatever amusement they had been enjoying was not worth what following through on it might cost them. Nobody said anything. Didn't think so, Eli said. He pushed off the wagon and walked toward the church entrance. His gait had the uneven rhythm of a man who had made a kind of peace with something he could not change, not apologetic, not self-conscious, just the way he moved now, and he moved through it without offering any explanation to anyone watching. He passed May without looking at her directly, but he stopped for just a moment, close enough that she could hear him clearly, without him needing to raise his voice. Miss Collier. His voice was rough in the way of a voice that hadn't been used for conversation in a long time. You don't have to walk in there alone. May was quiet for a moment. She looked at his profile. He was already facing the church door, giving her nothing but the side of his face, and on that face there was nothing she could read as pity, which was the thing she had been bracing against all morning. "I've been walking alone for 3 years," she said. "I expect I can manage the church steps." Something shifted in his expression. She caught it in profile. Not quite a reaction, more like the smallest possible acknowledgement. He nodded once and went through the door. May followed. The ceremony was brief. Preacher Holt Young knew enough to Coldwater Flats that he still believed ceremonies deserved to be conducted with dignity. Read the words carefully. His hands did not shake. He treated it like a real wedding. May appreciated that more than she could have said. Eli stood beside her and spoke the words when asked. His voice did not waver. His hands did not move toward hers. When it was done, they walked out into the heat together. Harriet Bloom stepped forward from the gathered crowd with the tight smile of a woman delivering a social obligation she considered beneath her standards. Harriet ran the dry goods store and considered herself the principal authority on matters of propriety in Coldwater Flats, and she had opinions about everything and shared them freely with whoever stood still long enough to receive them. "Well," Harriet said, "I'm sure you'll both make the best of it." Eli: "We do hope the ranch recovers." And May. Her eyes moved down and back up in a motion so practiced it almost passed for politeness. "Almost. I'm sure you'll find your footing." "She found it a long time ago," Eli said. He said it without looking at Harriet. He was checking the harness on the near horse, his hands moving through the leather with automatic competence, his tone as neutral as if he'd commented on the weather, which somehow made it worse for Harriet than anger would have. The color in her face shifted slightly. Her smile thinned to something barely qualifying as an expression. "Of course," she said, and stepped back into the crowd. May looked at Eli's profile. He finished with the harness. "Wagon's ready," he said. 2 hours to the ranch. I've got water in the back." That was their wedding conversation. May climbed up onto the bench without waiting for assistance. Eli came around and pulled himself up on the other side, the motion practiced and economical, managing the step without help and without making it a moment worth noting. He picked up the reins. The wagon moved forward into the flat white heat of the Montana morning. Nobody threw rice. Nobody called out good wishes. The town watched them go the way towns watch things that interest them quietly, assessingly, already composing the version of events they would tell each other later. May faced forward and watched the road. The 2 hours passed mostly in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, the silence of two people who had agreed at least implicitly that there was nothing required of them in this particular moment. May watched the landscape change as they moved north and west of town. The Rockies were visible to the northwest, pale blue and distant, the peaks still holding a suggestion of last winter's soul, even in July. The grass along the road had gone yellow-brown weeks ago. The creek beds they crossed were either dry or running thin and reluctant, and the cattle she could see on the properties they passed were staying close to whatever shade the cottonwoods provided. This was what a drought year looked like. She had seen one before, in her first year of marriage, when she and her husband had watched the feed costs climb week by week while the money went the other direction. She knew the particular arithmetic of it. She knew how much pressure it put on every decision a ranching family had to make, how it eliminated the margin for any mistake at all. She thought about the ledgers. She had caught a glimpse of papers on the desk inside the ranch house as they'd loaded the last of her belongings, barely a glimpse, just the arrangement of columns on a page, and something in that arrangement had caught in the back of her mind the way a splinter catches in skin. Not fully resolved, just present. When Danner Creek Ranch appeared through the heat shimmer ahead, May understood several things within the first 30 seconds of looking at it. The first was that the council had not been exaggerating when they described the ranch as struggling. What she had imagined, some rough but functional operation, the kind that could be turned around with disciplined management and a good season, was not what she was looking at. The east-facing wall of the main house had 2 sections that needed significant work. The kind of work that had been postponed long enough that postponing it further would cost considerably more. The water trough beside the barn had a crack running down its center that someone had attempted to fill with pitch without complete success. 2 fence sections were down between the road and the far pasture. The garden plot along the south side of the house was nothing but cracked earth and the skeletal remains of last year's plants. The second thing she understood was that Eli Danner saw all of it. Saw her seeing it. His jaw tightened, not with shame exactly, but with the harder thing underneath shame that a man carries when he has been watching something he built with his own hands come apart and has not been able to stop it. "Looks worse than it is," he said. "Does it?" May said. A pause. The wagon kept moving. "No," he said. "It looks about like it is." She respected that more than the first answer. 3 men were waiting in the narrow shade along the barn wall. They pushed themselves upright as the wagon came into the yard, with the slow energy of men who had been sitting long enough in the heat to make standing a considered effort. The youngest 19 or so, with red hair and a neck that had been sunburned and peeled so many times it had given up trying to tan, came forward and took the horse's head. "Boss?" He glanced at May, then back at Eli. "This her? Her name is Mrs. Danner," Eli said. "You'll use it." The young man's ears went red faster than his neck ever had. "Yes, sir." He turned to May with the slightly desperate courtesy of someone trying to recover lost ground. "Welcome, Mrs. Danner. I'm Beckett." "Beckett." May looked at him directly. "Where's the kitchen?" He blinked. "Ma'am, the kitchen," May said. "Where is it?" He pointed toward the side of the house. May climbed down from the wagon without waiting for anyone and walked toward it. She heard Beckett say something behind her in a low voice. Didn't catch the words. Didn't need to. She had been hearing the shape of those comments her entire adult life and had long ago stopped requiring the specific content to understand the general meaning. She went into the kitchen. The kitchen had not been properly cleaned since at least early spring. The stove had ash built up in it that told a clear story about how long it had been since anyone had cleared it. The shelves along the east wall were disorganized supplies grouped by accident rather than by logic. Things that should have been used months ago pushed behind things that were more recent. The flour bin was half empty. The water bucket was completely empty. May stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at all of it. Then she found the apron hanging on the nail beside the stove, tied it on, located the broom, and started. She was still working when Eli came through the door 20 minutes later. He stopped in the entrance and looked at the swept floor at the shelf she had already reorganized at the stove she had cleared and was in the process of blacking. He looked at her, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, a smear of ash on her forearm, moving through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been managing difficult spaces for a very long time. "You didn't have to start tonight," he said. "The stove was full of ash," May said. "I couldn't cook on it the way it was." "You don't have to cook tonight. I can manage with—" "Sit down, Mr. Danner." He stopped. She had not said it sharply. She had said it the way she said things that needed to be said without drama. She didn't look up from the pot she was filling. "You've been on that leg since before sunrise," she said. "Sit down. I'll have something ready in 40 minutes. There was a long pause. Then the sound of a chair scraping back from the kitchen table. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he. The kitchen filled with the ordinary sounds of food being prepared. Water beginning to heat a spoon against the side of a pot. The creak of the stove door as she checked the temperature. The small percussion of a working kitchen doing what a working kitchen was supposed to do. Sounds that a house needed, and from the condition of this one had been missing for longer than one evening. 40 minutes later, she set a plate down in front of him. He ate without speaking. She sat across the table and ate her own supper. The light outside the window shifted from gold to orange to the deep purple-gray of a Montana summer evening. Somewhere out in the yard, Beckett and the other 2 hands, the older one named Gideon, who had barely spoken since they arrived, and the 17-year-old called Orville, who had spoken too much, were finishing whatever the evening required of them. After a while, Eli set his fork down. "May," he said. She looked up. I didn't marry you for love. His voice was flat and direct, and not unkind. I want to be straight with you about that from the beginning. I married you because this ranch needs someone to manage the house through the cattle season, and I can't keep up with both things alone anymore, especially not with... He didn't finish that sentence, didn't gesture toward his leg. Just let the silence carry the meaning. That's the truth of it. May set her own fork down. I know that, she said. I didn't marry you for love either. I married you because I was 4 months behind on my boarding house bill, and the council made it clear I was out of options. She picked up her fork again. So we understand each other. He looked at her for a moment. We understand each other, he said. Good. She took a bite. I'll need to see the ranch ledgers tomorrow. Why? Because someone has to look at them carefully, May said. And from the condition of those fence lines and the water trough, I don't think anyone has looked carefully enough in some time. Something moved in Eli's expression. Something complicated. Not offense, not dismissal, but the reluctant recognition of a man who suspects he is about to hear something true that he has been avoiding. After breakfast, he said. After breakfast, May agreed. That night, May lay in the small room off the kitchen, a rope bed, a single shelf, a window that faced east, and listened to the ranch settle into silence. The heat was still thick even after sundown. The sky through the window was heavy with stars, the kind of sky that only appeared this far from any city, vast and indifferent and beautiful in a way that required a particular quality of quiet to properly receive. She was not afraid. She was tired and uncertain and very much aware that she was sleeping in a stranger's house on the same day she had married him. She had learned in the years after her husband died that fear was only useful for the first 30 seconds of any hard situation, long enough to register that attention was required, and actively harmful after that. She had not survived 3 years of widowhood and 4 months of charity by letting fear make her decisions. She thought about the ledgers. She had spent 2 years managing her late husband's feed store accounts. 2 years of learning what honest numbers looked like and how quickly they revealed themselves when they were not. Her husband, a good man, a trusting man, a man whose particular weakness was his inability to believe that someone he considered a friend might be working against him, had died owing money to 3 creditors, and May had spent the 8 months after his death doing the painstaking work of determining which debts were genuinely his and which were the result of a business partner who had been helping himself to the accounts in amounts small enough to avoid easy notice. She had not caught it in time. She had learned from that in ways she was still learning from. She thought about the arrangement of columns she had glimpsed on Eli's desk that afternoon. The particular way the figures had been grouped. Something in the spacing between entries, a rhythm that didn't quite match the rhythm of honest accounting. She thought, who manages the financial accounts for Dana Creek Ranch? She closed her eyes. She would know more tomorrow. She was up before Eli. The stove was lit. The coffee was made and the first biscuits were in the oven by the time she heard his boots on the floorboards of the hallway. He came through the kitchen door with his hair still damp from the water pump, moving with the deliberate focus of a man who had decided some time ago that the way he got from one place to another was nobody's business but his own. He stopped when he smelled the coffee. Something moved across his face. Quickly, and then it was gone, but she caught it, the expression of someone encountering something they had not expected and were not quite prepared for. "Morning," May said. "Morning," he said. He sat down. She poured. Outside, Beckett appeared at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands, and the cautious expression of a young man who had made some calculations overnight about how to present himself. "Mrs. Dana, ma'am." He addressed the back of her head where she was turned toward the stove. "The boys, Gideon and Orville, and me, we wanted to say that supper smelled real good last night. Tell them there are biscuits this morning if they're at the table in 10 minutes, May said without turning. Beckett disappeared faster than he'd arrived. Eli watched this exchange. He lifted his coffee cup, drank, set it down. "The ledgers are in the office," he said. "They're not in good order. I should tell you that. Roland Voss handles most of the accounts. He's a financial agent, manages the books, files the paperwork with the county, handles the supplier relationships. He's been helping manage the finances since my leg. A couple of winters back, before I was fully back on my feet. May turned from the stove and looked at Eli. She kept her expression neutral. Something in her chest had made a small cold adjustment at the name. Roland Voss. The way Eli said it, the particular ease of a man naming someone he trusted without having recently thought to question why, told her more than the name itself. "I trust him," Eli said. He paused. "I want you to know that up front." May held his gaze for a moment. "Of course," she said. "I'm just getting oriented. Old habit, I like to understand how a household runs." She turned back to the biscuits. The splinter in the back of her mind pressed in a little deeper. After breakfast, she sat at the desk in the ranch office with the ledger open in front of her and the door closed. Not to shut anyone out, she had told Eli as much, but because the heat came in through the south-facing windows and the paper needed to be kept from curling. He had accepted that explanation without comment and left her to it. May was not a formally educated woman. 4 years of schooling followed by whatever she had been able to teach herself from whatever books came within reach. But she had spent 2 years managing accounts, and she had spent 8 months untangling the aftermath of someone else's careful dishonesty, and she understood numbers the way some people understood music, not just the individual figures, but the relationships between them. The way certain arrangements implied certain patterns. The way honest accounts had a rhythm to them and dishonest ones had a different rhythm, quieter and more deliberate, like someone stepping carefully across a floor they were trying not to disturb. She turned to the first page and began. The first thing she noticed was the feed costs. The previous summer, $12.50 per month. Consistent. The current summer, $28 per month. The same supplier, the same cattle count. More than double the charge beginning exactly 22 months ago and continuing without interruption. She went back to the cattle inventory records and began cross-referencing. Her finger moved down the columns. Stopped, 40. Head in the spring count, 31 in the fall count. 9 animals unaccounted for between seasons. No record of sale, no record of disease or loss, no notation of any kind. Just a number that was smaller in October than it had been in April, with nothing in the ledger to explain why. She sat very still. She turned to a section near the back and found 3 entries she had not noticed on the first pass. Payments of $15 each grouped under a heading that read, simply, "Water access per private agreement, R. Voss." No county stamp. No reference to any official filing. A private name in a place where an official designation should have been. May set down her pen. Outside, she could hear Eli's voice somewhere near the barn, steady and measured, giving Beckett and the others some instruction about the morning work. She could hear Orville's response, too young and too eager. Gideon said nothing as far as she could tell. Gideon seemed like a man who had been saying nothing for a long time and had made a comfortable peace with it. She looked back at the page. Per private agreement, R. Voss. She didn't move for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and began to make notes, careful. Organized everything labeled and dated and arranged in columns that would be easy to read quickly and clearly, the way accounts should always be arranged. She had learned in 8 months of untangling her husband's accounts that the most important thing about evidence was that someone else could follow it without your help. You would not always be there to explain. The document needed to speak for itself. Roland Voss arrived on the morning of the 3rd day. May heard him before she saw him. The confident rhythm of a horse ridden by someone who wanted to be heard, arriving the particular pace that communicated ease and ownership without any single element you could point to. Then his voice calling out to Beckett in the yard, with the warm familiarity of a man who had been calling out to people in this yard for long enough that it felt natural to him. "Beckett, son, how's that neck holding up in this heat?" "Better, Mr. Voss. Boss is out checking the north fence section. No rush at all. I'll wait." May kept her hands on the sheet she was hanging on the line behind the house. She did not turn around. She heard his footsteps cross the yard, heard them slow. "Well now," said a voice. "You must be the new Mrs. Danner." She turned then. He was perhaps 45. Well-dressed for a ranch visit, the kind of well-dressed that communicated prosperity without being ostentatious about it. A face that had been arranged by years of practice into an expression of open, warm, entirely approachable friendliness. He held his hat in both hands. He was smiling in the way that people smile when they have learned that smiling is one of the most effective tools available to them. Everything about him said, "I am a man you can trust." May had known men like Roland Voss her entire adult life. She had known one very well for 2 years while he helped himself to her husband's money in careful, quiet increments. She recognized the quality of a warmth that had been constructed rather than grown. "Mr. Voss," she said. He took a small step forward. "I didn't know Eli had gotten married." He said it with a self-deprecating laugh, charming, self-aware. "That's Eli for you. Man of few words. He manages the financial accounts for Danner Creek." He gestured toward himself with easy modesty. "I've been helping him navigate a rough stretch these past 2 years. He paused, and his smile warmed in a way that was supposed to communicate sincerity. "I'm glad he finally has someone to help keep things running smoothly here at the house." "Keep things running smoothly here at the house." May looked at him. "That's generous of you," she said, "just being neighborly." He glanced toward the back door with the casual air of a man accustomed to being invited inside. "It's something fierce out here today. Mind if I wait in the shade inside Eli's at the north fence?" May said. "I'll send Beckett to let him know you're here. There's water in the bucket by the porch." The warmth in Roland Voss's expression did not disappear. It adjusted. A barely perceptible recalibration, the response of a man who had been offered less than he expected and was deciding how to receive it without revealing that he had expected more. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "Thank you, Mrs. Danner." May turned back to the laundry. She listened to him settle onto the porch bench and pour water from the bucket and begin an easy, friendly conversation with Beckett, who was young enough and open-natured enough to answer everything he was asked. She listened to Roland Voss ask about the North Fence project, ask about the Eastern Water Gate, ask about whether Eli had made any decisions yet about the fall cattle drive schedule, ask about how many head were currently in the south pasture. She kept hanging sheets. She kept listening. When Eli came back from the fence line, his shirt soaked through with sweat, his jaw carrying the tight set of a man who had been wrestling hardware in 100-degree heat since first light. His whole face changed when he saw Roland Voss on the porch. Not dramatically. Just the way a face opens when it encounters something familiar and categorized as safe. Vic Eli said, "Didn't know you were coming out today. Thought I'd check in. Summer's moving fast and I wanted to go over the water rights renewal before the county deadline." Voss clapped Eli on the shoulder with easy familiarity. "Brought the paperwork." "Good. Come inside." Eli glanced toward where May had come around the corner of the house with the empty laundry basket. "May, you remember I mentioned Roland?" "We introduced ourselves," May said pleasantly. She watched something move across Roland Voss's expression, a smoothing over, quick and practiced. "Your wife was very welcoming," he said. They went inside. May set down the laundry basket and went to the kitchen and began preparing the noon meal. The office door was not fully pulled shut. She could not make out specific words, only the rhythm of 2 men talking. Roland's voice, moving easily between lightness and seriousness, the voice of a man skilled at controlling the temperature of a room. Eli's voice lower, responding occasionally, asking a short question. She moved quietly through the kitchen. She got close enough to the hallway once to catch a few words through the gap. "Water renewal fee. I'll handle the filing. You don't need to come into town for it. I'll take care of everything." She went back to the kitchen. She kept her face neutral and her hands busy and thought very carefully about what she already knew and what she still needed to find out. Roland Voss stayed for the noon meal. He was excellent at a table complimenting the food, drawing Beckett out about his family back in Nebraska, telling a story about a neighboring rancher's horse that made even Gideon's expression shift towards something resembling amusement. He was good at this. May acknowledged it without reservation. He was very, very good at making a room feel comfortable. Mrs. Danner Roland said at one point, turning to her with an easy smile, Eli tells me you've been having a look at the account books. May looked up from her plate. Just getting oriented, she said. Her voice was light conversational. Old habit from managing my husband's accounts years back. I like to understand how a household operates, of course. Roland's smile didn't shift by a fraction. If you have any questions about any of the entries, please just ask me directly. I've set up the system in a particular way. Some of the categories can look unusual if you're not familiar with how ranch accounting works. It's a specialized area. It's very organized, May said. I had one small question, actually. Roland's smile held at exactly the same position. The feed costs this year compared to last year, they're quite a bit higher. She kept her voice pleasant and curious, the tone of someone asking about something she had noticed without any particular significance attached to it. Is that the drought pushing supplier prices up across the board, or is there a new arrangement with the supplier? A pause. Brief enough that most people at the table would not have noticed it, but May was watching for it, and she caught it a stillness behind his eyes that lasted less than a second before the explanation came. Droughts hit everyone hard this year, Roland said. Prices are up all across the region. I've been working to negotiate the best rates I can find. It's a constant effort in a year like this. Of course, May said. Thank you for explaining that. She went back to her plate. Across the table, Eli was looking at her. She felt it without meeting his eyes. The particular quality of his attention had shifted something in it more alert than before, the look of a man who had heard something and was filing it carefully without yet knowing what to do with it. Roland changed the subject smoothly, and May let him. She made sure her face said nothing that wasn't supposed to be said. He left an hour later with a signed authorization form, Eli's signature, on a water rights renewal filing that Roland would process with the county office on his behalf. May stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the horse and rider move down the road until the dust settled behind them. You don't like him, Eli's voice from behind her. Close. She didn't turn. I don't know him well enough to have an opinion, she said. That wasn't what your face said at the table. She turned. Eli was standing 2 feet away, arms crossed, watching her with eyes that were more observant than she had yet given him credit for. I asked a straightforward question about the accounts, she said. You asked it in front of him on purpose. May said nothing for a moment. Give me 3 days with the ledgers, she said. His jaw worked. He's helped me through things I couldn't have managed alone. After the leg, he was one of the only people who came around. He helped me keep this place from going under when I had no business being able to keep it. I know that, May said. And I'm not saying anything against him. I'm saying give me 3 days with the books. Then we'll talk. She held his gaze. I'm not going to tell you something about a man you trust based on a feeling and a price comparison. That's not fair to you or to him. Give me 3 days. A long silence. 3 days, Eli said. His voice was not easy, but he said it. 3 days, May agreed. She went back into the kitchen. That night, after the ranch had gone quiet and the August stars were thick and white above the Montana plain, May sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while before she went to bed. Not from agitation, she was past agitation. From the particular stillness that came over her when something had been decided, and what remained was simply the work. She thought about Roland Voss's pause when she asked about the feed costs. A fraction of a second, and then the explanation had come smooth and warm and complete. The pause was the tell. An honest man didn't pause before explaining something ordinary. An honest man didn't need to locate the explanation before delivering it, because an honest man hadn't rehearsed one. She thought about the water rights payments, 3 of them made to a private name with no county stamp. She thought about 9 head of cattle that had simply stopped existing between one season and the next, with nothing in the record to explain where they had gone. She thought someone has been helping themselves to this ranch for a long time, in amounts small enough not to cause alarm, in ways that would look to a man managing a painful injury and a struggling operation and the slow accumulated weight of too many hard years like nothing more than the ordinary friction of difficult circumstances. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. 3 days. She would have what she needed in 3 days. The second morning, May was at the desk before the sky had fully decided to be light. She had slept 4 hours enough. She had learned in the years after her husband died that the body adapted to what was required of it, and what was required of her right now was attention. Not rest, not comfort. Attention. The office was still cool from the night the way rooms in old ranch houses held the cold a few hours past dawn before the heat reclaimed them. May lit the lamp on the desk, set her notes from the previous evening beside the open ledger, and began. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, without rushing, letting the numbers speak in the order they chose to speak, rather than looking for what she expected to find. This was the first discipline of honest accounting. You did not arrive with conclusions. You arrived with questions, and you let the figures answer them. The feed costs were the clearest starting point, because they were the most visible anomaly. She had already noted the jump from $12.50 per month to $28, beginning 22 months ago and continuing without variation. Now she went deeper. She located the receipt box in the bottom drawer of the desk, buried under a stack of old correspondence Eli. It seemed kept every receipt he received, but had stopped cross-referencing them against the ledger entries at some point in the recent past. She understood why. A man managing a painful injury and 3 ranch hands and a cattle operation in a drought year with someone else handling the accounts would not have the hours to sit at a desk and verify every figure. That was the whole logic of delegating the accounts to someone else. You did it because you trusted the person and because you did not have the capacity to do it yourself. May pulled every feed receipt from the box and laid them out in chronological order. Then she went through the ledger entries one by one, matching each receipt amount against the corresponding ledger entry. They did not match. Not slightly, not within a reasonable margin that might be explained by rounding or processing fees. The feed supplier's receipts showed consistent charges throughout the previous year, $12.50 per month. As she had noted, with minor variations, she could explain by cattle count and seasonal need. The ledger entries in Roland Voss's neat, regular handwriting showed $19 per month for the same period, a difference of $6.50 every single month. For 12 months, $78, billed to the ranch, not paid to the supplier. May set the receipts down. She picked up her pen. She wrote the figure in her notes with the months listed beside it, the receipt amounts and the ledger amounts in 2 separate columns. The discrepancy in a third column, each row precise and clear. She had learned in 8 months of untangling her husband's accounts that the most important thing about evidence was that someone else could follow it without her help. She would not always be there to explain. The document needed to speak for itself. She turned to the cattle records. She had already noted the 9 head missing between the spring and fall count of the most recent year. Now she went further back. 2 years. 3 years. She tracked the numbers across every season. She had records for cross-referencing the spring counts with the fall counts, looking for the pattern beneath the individual instances. She found it. It was as regular and deliberate as a heartbeat. Every summer, between the spring count and the fall count, 4 to 7 had disappeared from the Danner Creek herd. Not dying, there were no loss records, no veterinary notations, no entries describing disease or accident. Not sold, there were no sale records, no buyer names, no amounts received. Just a number in the spring that was consistently larger than the number in the fall, with nothing in the record to bridge the gap. 3 years. A minimum of 14 head, and possibly as many as 20, depending on how the counting had been done in the years where the records were less precise. At current market price, May did the calculation carefully, checking it twice, approximately $22 a head. $440, possibly more. She put her pen down. She pressed both palms flat on the desk and breathed steadily for a moment. She looked at what the numbers had told her, and she let herself sit with the full weight of what they meant. A man had come to Eli Danner at his most vulnerable, injured, isolated, watching his ranch deteriorate around him with no clear way to stop it, and had presented himself as help. And he had been help in the ways that were visible. The accounts had been organized. The paperwork had been handled. The things that required someone to drive into town and deal with officials and suppliers had been dealt with because Eli could not easily do those things himself in those early months after the accident. And in exchange, Roland Voss had been helping himself to the ranch in the way that careful, patient men help themselves in amounts small enough that they read as ordinary friction as the expected costs of difficult circumstances as the natural financial pressure of a drought year and a hard cattle season. Not enough to alarm. Exactly enough to slowly, steadily bleed a struggling operation dry. May folded her notes and slid them into the pocket sewn into the lining of her skirt. The pocket she had added herself years ago because she had learned that important things needed to be kept close and accessible. Then she went out to start breakfast because the morning work on a ranch did not wait for conclusions to be reached, and she had not yet gathered everything she needed. The water rights entries nagged at her most. She could quantify the feed discrepancy. She could document the missing cattle across the record. But the 3 payments of $15 each listed simply as water access per private agreement. Voss with no county stamp and no official reference, those she could not evaluate from inside the ranch office. Those required the county records. And the county records were in Coldwater Flats. She mentioned to Eli at breakfast that she needed to go into town for flour. He nodded and told her to take the mule, and she did. She bought the flour. She paid for it with a small amount of household money he had given her access to, and then she walked down the main street of Coldwater Flats, past the saloon and the hardware store, and the telegraph office to the low wooden building at the end of the block that housed the county administrative offices. Silas Webb. The county clerk was a thin and meticulous man who wore the same green-visored cap every day of his working life and had a talent for making people feel that whatever they were asking for was slightly more than they were entitled to. He looked up when May came through the door, and she watched him take in her size, her plain dress, the flour sack under her arm, and make several quiet calculations about her social position and the degree of deference she was therefore owed. She had dealt with men like Silas Webb before. The trick was to move faster than their assessments. "Mrs. Danner," she said before he could establish the terms of the interaction. "Eli Danner's wife from Danner Creek Ranch. I need to review the water rights filing records for the property." Webb blinked. "Those are official county records." "Yes," May said. "I know. Mr. Danner has an interest in reviewing his own filings." She set the flour sack on the counter and folded her hands on top of it and looked at him with the pleasant, unhurried expression of someone who had all day and expected to get what she came for. He got the ledger. The water rights renewal for Danner Creek Ranch had been filed with the county office 11 days ago. Filed by Roland Voss as authorized agent for the property owner. May read the filing carefully, the legal description of the property boundaries, the description of the water access rights being renewed, the metes and bounds language that specified exactly which portions of Danner Creek the filing claimed rights to. Then she asked for the original deed filing from 10 years ago. Webb brought it, and she laid the 2 documents side by side on the counter and read them together. The original deed filed when Eli Danner purchased the property in 1879 at age 28 described a water access boundary running along the full length of the eastern fork of Danner Creek, both the upper section where the creek ran swift and clean out of the foothills and the lower section where it widened and slowed before joining the main branch. The upper section was where the primary cattle watering source was located. It was where the water ran deep enough and clean enough to sustain a herd through a dry summer. The renewal filing described only the lower section. The upper section, the primary source, the water that the Danner Creek herd depended on, had been omitted from the renewal. Not dramatically. Not obviously. In a single clause of boundary description where the language shifted from both upper and lower to simply lower, in the same legal terminology with the same formatting, so that a person reading quickly would see a water rights renewal document and might not immediately notice that what was being renewed was meaningfully different from what had originally been granted. May stood very still in the county clerk's office with both documents in her hands and understood exactly what she was looking at. If the renewal was accepted as filed and the deadline for contesting it was 8 days away, Eli Danner would lose legal water access to the primary source on his own property. The herd could not survive on the lower section alone through a drought year. Not with the cattle count he was carrying and the dry conditions that showed no sign of breaking. He would have one option: negotiate to buy access to water he had held legal rights to for 10 years, or sell. And Roland Voss May was quite certain already knew who might make a reasonable offer on a struggling Montana ranch that had just unexpectedly lost its primary water rights. "I need copies of both of these," she said, "with the county stamp." Webb looked at her with the expression of a man deciding whether this was worth the effort of objecting. "That will take some time," he said. May set the flour sack more firmly on the counter. "I'll wait," she said. She was back at the ranch before supper. Eli was at the kitchen table when she came through the door, a cup of coffee going cold in front of him, his hat on the table beside it. He had the look of a man who had put in a very long day and was currently in the process of deciding whether sitting was a permanent condition. He looked up when she came in. Something in her face made him set the coffee cup down. "What did you find?" he said. It was not quite a question. May set the flour on the shelf. Then she went to the bedroom and retrieved her notes from the lining pocket of her skirt, and she came back to the kitchen and laid everything out on the table in order: the feed receipt comparisons, the cattle count documentation spanning 3 years, the bank discrepancy estimates, and finally the 2 stamped copies from the county clerk's office placed side by side, so the difference between them was immediately visible to anyone who read them carefully. She sat down across from him. She waited while he read. She watched his face the way she had learned to watch faces when the thing being read was important, not intrusively. Not with the performance of concern, but with the steady attention of someone who understood that a person's face in the moment of grasping something difficult was a form of communication that words often couldn't match. Eli read slowly. She could see him following the columns, see the moment he understood the feed discrepancy, the slight change in the set of his shoulders, the quality of his stillness shifting. She saw the moment he understood the cattle count. His hand, which had been resting loosely on the table, pressed down more firmly against the wood. She saw the moment he understood the water rights documents he had to read the 2 boundary descriptions twice, and she knew exactly when the difference between them landed, because his entire body went still in the way that bodies go still when something of fundamental importance has just been fully grasped. He looked up. "How long?" he said. "I'm certain of 3 years," May said. "The records only go back that far with the clarity I needed. It could be longer." His jaw tightened. 3 years, at minimum. He looked back at the table. His hand, still flat against the wood, was pressing hard enough now that she could see the tension in his forearm. Not fear, not weakness. The particular physical response of a man whose understanding of the past 2 years of his life has just been fundamentally revised, and whose body is registering that revision before his mind has finished processing what it means. "He sat in front of this house," Eli said quietly. "2 weeks ago. Ate at this table. I know. He told me I should think about selling." His voice was very controlled. "Said the finances were too far gone. Said he knew of a buyer who'd give me a fair price, someone interested in Montana ranch land, someone who could move quickly." May said nothing. She let him follow it to the end himself. "He was the one making the finances too far gone," Eli said. "Yes." Another silence. Long enough that she heard Beckett and Orville talking outside somewhere near the barn. Gideon's voice, once brief and low, and then nothing. "What do we do?" Eli said. May straightened the papers in front of her. "The bank first," she said. "We need a full account statement directly from Coldwater Flats Savings and Loan, not through Voss, directly from the bank, with everything that has moved through the account for the past 3 years. The bank statement will show the actual withdrawals versus what the ledger claims was spent. The gap between those numbers is documented theft, not a theory." He looked at her steadily. Then she said, "We need to contest the water rights renewal with the county. The filing period closes in 8 days. We need a lawyer to put the contest together in a form the county will act on. There's no lawyer in Coldwater Flats. There's one in Bozeman." She had already thought about this. Beckett's horse is faster than the mule. If he leaves tonight, he can be in Bozeman by morning and back with an answer by tomorrow evening. Eli stared at her for a moment. "We don't have—" "I have $10, May said. "My last $10 from what I brought from the boarding house. I was keeping it against pure emergency." She met his eyes. This qualifies. Something moved in Eli Danner's face. Not just the acknowledgement of what she had just offered. Something larger and harder to name, the expression of a man who has been alone in something difficult for long enough that the experience of not being alone in it anymore is almost more than he knows what to do with. "I have 5 in the box under the bed," he said after a moment. "Then we have 15, May said. "Get Beckett." Beckett ate 3 biscuits standing up and was on the ranch's best horse within the hour, a sealed packet of notes in his saddlebag, and the name Thomas Hale, attorney at law, Bozeman, written on the front in May's careful hand. May stood in the yard and watched him ride into the darkening east. 8 days before the water rights filing period closed. 8 days was enough. If Thomas Hale was the kind of lawyer she hoped he was, 8 days was more than enough. She went inside and washed the supper dishes. She was still at the basin when Eli came back through the kitchen after checking on the horses. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "May." She looked up. "Why are you doing this?" His voice was rough and quiet. "You've been here 3 days. This isn't your fight. You didn't ask for any of this." May dried her hands on the dish towel. "I'm Mrs. Danner," she said. "This is my ranch too, whether either of us planned for that to be true." She looked at him directly. "And I will not sit in a house that is being stolen from under me and pretend I don't see it happening." She set the dish towel down. "Nobody takes what's ours," she said. "Not without a fight." Eli looked at her for a long moment. He did not say anything, but something in the guarded, carefully maintained expression he had worn since the morning she arrived shifted, not much, not dramatically, but enough. Like a door that has been latched for a long time and has now been unlatched, even if it hasn't yet been opened. He nodded once and went to his room. May stood alone in the kitchen and looked at the dark window above the sink and thought about Roland Voss, somewhere in Coldwater Flats tonight, with his polished smile and his careful accounts and his already prepared buyer, entirely unaware that a woman he had dismissed on sight as a charity arrangement with no resources and no standing had spent the last 3 days building a case that was going to dismantle everything he had constructed over the past 3 years. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. The 4th morning arrived without ceremony. May woke in the thin grey light before dawn to the sound of horses, more than one, and moving too fast for a normal working approach. She was at the window before she was fully awake, and in the pre-dawn dimness she saw 2 riders in the road beyond the gate moving away at a hard gallop toward the direction of town. She was dressed and out the back door in under 2 minutes. Beckett was already in the yard, running from the direction of the creek, his red hair dark with sweat, even in the morning cool. "Mrs. Danner." He was breathing hard. His face was pale under the permanent flush of his sunburn. The east gate, the one on the upper fork. Someone cut it. The herd's getting through into the east ravine, and if they go deep in before the heat. "Go," May said. He ran. She heard him calling for Gideon and Orville as he went. May stood in the yard for a moment. 2 riders. Not ranch hands. She knew the sound of the ranch horses, and these had been different animals. And they had been leaving, not arriving, moving fast toward town. She thought about the conversation at the noon meal 3 days ago. She thought about Voss asking Beckett about the East Gate schedule. She thought about the water trough and the cattle count and the pattern of a man who had been gathering information about this ranch for 2 years under the cover of being its most reliable friend. She went back inside. She did not go to the bedroom. She went directly to the office. She took every document, her notes, the receipt comparisons, the cattle count records, the 2 stamped copies from the county clerk, and she wrapped them in the oilskin cloth she had found in the supply closet 2 days ago and set aside for exactly this kind of eventuality. She tied the bundle with twine and carried it to the kitchen. She opened the flour bin, moved the sack she had bought in town to one side, and set the oilskin packet at the bottom of the bin, beneath a good 6 inches of flour. She smoothed the surface, replaced the sack, and set the lid back. Then she lit the stove and began making breakfast. She had the biscuits in and the porridge on when Eli came through the back door, 90 minutes later. He looked the way men looked after 90 minutes of hard work in heat that had already climbed past 80 degrees before 7 in the morning, wrung out tightly controlled, carrying something he was not going to put down until he had assessed the full extent of what he was carrying. He sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands flat on the wood and breathed. 3 head, he said after a moment. We got 11 back. 3 went too deep into the ravine in this heat. They won't. May set the coffee in front of him. He looked at it, didn't pick it up immediately. The gate was cut, he said. Gideon checked it. Clean cut, done with a proper tool. Not rust, not wear. Someone cut it deliberately. His eyes came up to May's face. She held his gaze. I know, she said quietly. He knows we found something, or suspects it, May said. Which means we have less time than I thought. How much time do we have? She moved to the stove to check the biscuits. The water rights deadline is in 7 days now. Beckett should be back by this evening with word from Bozeman. We need to move before Voss can make the next move. What's the next move? May was quiet for a moment. She knew the shape of what Roland Voss would do because she had watched a man do a version of it once before, not in a courtroom, but in the quieter arena of a community's good opinion. When your scheme starts to unravel, you don't run. You get ahead of the story. You walk into the sheriff's office before anyone can walk in and name you, and you make yourself the aggrieved party before anyone else can make you the accused one. He'll go to the law before we can, she said. He'll frame it as something else, defamation interference, a new wife who doesn't understand ranch business stirring up trouble. He'll try to make us look like the problem before we can make him look like the criminal. Eli's jaw tightened. Can he do that? He can try. She turned from the stove. Which is why Beckett goes back to Bozeman as soon as he eats and gets a fresh horse. Not tomorrow, today. We don't give Voss 4 days to maneuver. Beckett appeared at the kitchen door at that moment, hat in hand, the particular exhausted relief of someone who has done what they could and is ready to be told what comes next. He lost 3, he said to Eli. I'm sorry, boss. We couldn't get to them in time. Sit down and eat, May said. You're riding back to Bozeman in an hour. Beckett sat down. Gideon and Orville came in behind him. Gideon's face was the same careful neutral it always was, but his eyes, steady and more observant than she had initially credited, went from the kitchen to May to Eli and arrived at a quiet conclusion. He sat. Orville sat, and looked like he was working very hard not to say something which was a genuine effort for him. The kitchen filled with the sounds of people eating. Nobody spoke. But the quality of the silence was different from the first morning she had made breakfast here. Not the careful silence of strangers assessing each other, but the purposeful quiet of people who were in something together and were conserving themselves for what was coming. Beckett left for Bozeman with a fresh horse and a second letter before the morning heat had reached its full force. That evening, Roland Voss sat in Sheriff Neil Pruitt's office for the better part of an hour. May did not know this when it happened. She learned it when Beckett rode back the following afternoon, not just with Thomas Hale's response, but with information passed along by a man named Hartley, who ran the telegraph office and had no particular loyalty to Roland Voss. Voss had been seen going into the sheriff's office the previous evening, carrying a leather document case and coming out without it. Gideon filled in the rest in the quiet, flat way Gideon filled in things that Pruitt and Voss had been friendly for years, the kind of friendly that involved regular evenings at the Silver Elk Saloon and the occasional exchange of favors that neither party felt any need to record. May heard all of this standing in the yard in the fading afternoon light and understood exactly what it meant. He's going to come here tomorrow morning, she said. Eli, standing beside her, said, With what grounds? Whatever grounds he's invented, May said. It doesn't matter what they are. What matters is that we're not caught off balance when he arrives. She thought for a moment about how Voss had known to move this quickly. He hadn't been at the ranch since the noon meal 4 days ago. The gate had been cut that morning. Someone had been watching the property, or someone had talked. In a town the size of Coldwater Flats, a woman asking Silas Webb To pull water rights documents on the same week that a lawyer from Bozeman was consulted was not information that stayed private for long. Webb himself might not have said anything intentionally, but small towns had their own circulation system, and Roland Voss had spent 2 years making himself useful to enough people that information reached him when it needed to. She went back inside and composed a second letter to Thomas Hale by lamplight, explaining the new development, asking what it would cost to have the water rights contest filed by the following afternoon instead of waiting until the end of the week. She wrote carefully. She stated the situation without drama. She asked a direct question and left space for a direct answer. Then she set the letter aside and made sure the oilskin packet was still safely buried in the flour bin, which it was undisturbed. Pruitt arrived the next morning at 8:15 with a deputy May didn't recognize, and the expression of a man doing something he had been asked to do rather than something he had chosen to do on his own initiative. May was in the kitchen. She heard the horses, heard Eli's voice in the yard steady and controlled. She stood at the kitchen counter with both hands around a coffee cup and listened to every word she could catch. Pruitt read from a paper he was carrying. The words she could make out were complaint, an authorized agent, and interference with lawful business arrangements. Eli let him finish. Then, Eli said clearly enough that she caught every word through the kitchen window. That authorization was revoked at the bank 6 days ago. August Cole can confirm it. And before you take Roland Voss's account of anything at face value, I'd suggest you speak with Thomas Hale in Bozeman. He filed a water rights contest on my behalf with the county clerk this morning. A pause, long enough that she could hear the horses shifting their weight at the hitching post. Pruitt's voice lower now, some of the official quality gone out of it. A brief exchange, then the sound of horses leaving. The back door opened, and Eli came in. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at May. Hale filed this morning, he said. Beckett made it, May said. He made it. She set her coffee cup down. Then we're still in this. We're still in it, Eli said. He crossed to the table and sat down, not with defeat, but with the weight of a man who has been holding himself at a particular level of tension for several days and has just received the first indication that the tension may eventually be able to release. He looked at her across the table. At the kitchen she had cleaned and reorganized. At the woman who had arrived 8 days ago in a brown cotton dress with $10 sewn into a pocket she'd made herself, and who had in those 8 days done something that he, in 3 years of managing this ranch alone, had not been able to do. May, he said. She looked up. I need to say something. She waited. When you asked about the feed costs at the table, he said, with Voss sitting right there. He looked at her steadily. I knew what you were doing. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to know what you'd found. He stopped. That was wrong. May was quiet for a moment. You were protecting something you hoped was still true, she said. That's not wrong. That's human. I should have looked at the books myself 2 years ago. You were managing an injury alone, May said. He positioned himself to be there when you couldn't manage everything. That's what men like him do. They wait for the gap and they step into it. The failure belongs to him, not to you. Eli looked at her for a long time. How did you know what to look for? He said. Not the accounts, I understand the accounts, but you walked in here not knowing any of us, and inside a week, you had the whole shape of it. May folded her hands on the table. I made a mistake once, she said. A serious one. She looked at her hands. My husband had a business partner who was doing something very similar to what Voss has been doing here. In amounts small enough that I convinced myself there were other explanations. I kept finding other explanations for almost 2 years. She looked up. I do not make that mistake twice. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Eli said. About your husband. He was a good man, May said. He trusted the wrong person. So did you. She held his gaze. The difference is, we caught it while there's still something left to save. He nodded once. The hearing is set for Thursday, he said. Hale sent word with Beckett. Thursday. 4 days. We'll be ready, May said. Thomas Hale arrived 2 days later and spent 6 hours at the kitchen table with May, going through every document she had assembled, the receipt comparisons, the cattle count discrepancies, the bank authorization records, the water rights boundary analysis, building the presentation of evidence in the order most likely to make it clear to a judge who would be seeing it for the first time. He was 36 years old, with wire-rimmed glasses and the manner of someone who had grown up in a city and come west, not for romance, but because the law in Montana in 1889 was still being written in real time, and he found that considerably more interesting than anything on offer back east. He asked precise questions. He took notes in a narrow book with a fine pointed pen. He asked May to walk through the feed discrepancy logic twice, then the water rights boundary analysis twice more. When she had finished the fourth complete walkthrough, he looked at her over the top of his glasses. "Mrs. Danner," he said, "I want you to present the financial documentation to the court directly, with me guiding the questions, not as a supporting witness, as the primary presenter of the evidence." Eli looked at Hale. "Is that advisable?" "It's more than advisable," Hale said. "She understands this material better than I do. A judge responds to clarity and confidence." He paused. "Voss's lawyer, and he will have won. Someone good likely from Cheyenne is going to try to undermine the source of the evidence rather than argue the evidence itself, because the evidence itself is not arguable." He looked at May. "He will say things designed to make you doubt yourself in front of a room full of people. I want to see if he can." May looked at Thomas Hale. "He can't," she said. Hale almost smiled. "That is exactly what I thought." That night, after Hale had taken the spare room and Eli had turned in, May sat alone at the kitchen table with the documents in front of her one final time. Not reviewing them, she knew them. She sat with them instead, the way you sat with something important, before you were required to carry it in front of people who had already made up their minds about whether you were worth listening to. She thought about the woman who had stood at the gate of the Coldwater Flats Community Church 8 days ago in a dress let out twice at the seams. That woman had been ready for a long time. She simply had not known until now what she had been getting ready for. She straightened the papers. She wrapped them carefully in the oilskin. She left them on the desk where she could find them in the morning. She blew out the lamp. She was ready. The morning of the trial came in cold and still. May was awake before the sky lightened. She had slept in 3-hour intervals, not from fear, but from the particular alertness of someone who is prepared as thoroughly as preparation allows and is now simply waiting for the thing to begin. She had laid her clothes out the night before, the gray dress with the high collar, the one she had worn to negotiate the lease on her husband's land after he died, the one she had worn to every hard conversation she'd had in the 4 years since. It was not a dress that asked for sympathy. It was a dress that said she had been in difficult rooms before and had walked out of all of them. She washed her face in cold water. She braided her hair tight and pinned it flat. She looked at herself in the square of mirror above the washstand for exactly 3 seconds, which was long enough to confirm that she looked like a woman who understood the difference between what she felt and what she was prepared to show. Eli was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs. He had made coffee and set a plate of biscuits on the table, and he was standing at the window looking out at the yard, his weight balanced the way he always stood when he was thinking hard about something he wasn't going to say out loud. The morning light caught the lines around his eyes. He had not slept much either, she thought, though he would not have admitted it. He heard her come in. He did not turn right away. "Beckett get back last night?" May asked. "Late. Hale was with him. They're staying at the Caldwell house. Hale wanted to go over the documents one more time before morning." Eli turned from the window. He looked at her steadily, the way he had started to look at her since the night she had laid the ledgers out on his table and shown him what she had found. It was not a look of surprise or gratitude. It was something more considered than either. "You eat something." "I will. Before we go." "Not after." May sat down and ate a biscuit and drank a cup of coffee that was stronger than she usually made it and considerably better. She did not ask him when he had learned to make coffee like that. There would be time for small questions later. Right now, there was only the day ahead. Gideon came in from the barn at 6:30. He had fed the horses and watered the remaining cattle and checked the water level in the secondary trough. He gave his report in the spare, efficient way he gave all reports, with no editorializing and no emotion, which May had come to understand was itself a kind of loyalty. The loyalty of a man who kept doing his work regardless of what was happening around it. "Level's holding," he said. "Won't hold forever without the main gate, but it'll hold for today." "That's all we need," Eli said. Orville appeared in the doorway behind Gideon, his hat already pushed back on his head, his face carrying the expression of someone who had approximately 15 things to say and was exercising considerable restraint in not saying any of them yet. He had been like that for 2 days ever since the sheriff had ridden out and turned around and left. Orville had watched that entire exchange from the fence post and had apparently stored every second of it for future commentary. "You want me to come?" Orville asked. "No," Eli and May said simultaneously. Orville nodded as if he had expected this. "I'll watch the cattle." "Gideon'll watch the cattle. You fixed the north fence section that came loose in the wind." Orville appeared to weigh whether this was a reasonable deployment of his abilities and concluded, possibly for the first time in his 17 years, that now was not the moment to argue. "Yes, sir," he said. He looked at May. "You're going to win," he added with the absolute confidence of someone who has never personally attended a trial and therefore holds no particular fear of them. May looked at him. "Go fix the fence, Orville." He went. They rode into Coldwater Flats at 8:15. The trial was set for 9, and Thomas Hale had told them to arrive early enough to review a few final points before court convened. The town looked the same as it always looked at that hour. The general store not yet opened, the blacksmith's fire just starting to show smoke, the 2 dogs that slept outside the grain depot stretched in the early sun. But there were more wagons and horses tied along the main street than May had seen on a weekday in the 3 weeks she had lived here, and more people moving with the particular purposeful unhurriedness of people who have come from some distance to watch something they consider worth watching. They recognized her. She could feel it, the way attention shifts direction without quite becoming obvious. A woman coming out of the dry goods store paused with her hand on the door. 2 men talking outside the post office went quiet as she and Eli rode past. It was not hostile exactly. It was the focused watchfulness of a community that has heard several different versions of a story and is trying, by looking at the principles directly, to triangulate toward the true one. Harriet Bloom was standing outside her store with her arms folded and her expression arranged in the way it was always arranged, as if she was evaluating the overall quality of the morning and finding it adequate but not exceptional. When May rode past, Harriet gave a single deliberate nod. It was not warm exactly. It was the nod of a woman who had formed an opinion and was comfortable letting you know she had formed it. May nodded back. Thomas Hale met them at the courthouse steps. He was younger than she had expected when Beckett first described him, 36, lean, with the careful, watchful eyes of someone who had spent years learning to read rooms before he walked into them. He was carrying a leather satchel that looked as if it weighed considerably more than it should, and his jacket was pressed to a standard that suggested he had woken even earlier than she had. "May," he said. "Eli." He shook Eli's hand first, then May's. "How are you holding together?" "Fine," Eli said. "Good. That's the right answer." Hale glanced at the satchel. "I have the county deed registry copy, your original ledger pages. The 3 annotated receipts, the bank withdrawal records. August Cole provided to me yesterday afternoon, and Silas Webb's amended survey documentation. We are in good shape. Better than I expected when Beckett rode into my office 6 days ago." He looked at May specifically when he said that last part. "The water rights alteration was the piece I wasn't sure we could prove. The survey document Webb pulled settled it." "What about Voss?" Eli asked. "Voss retained Marcus Greer out of Helena. Greer is competent, and he is not above personal attacks, which means he will almost certainly go after May's standing as a recent arrival and recent wife. I want you prepared for that." He was looking at May when he said it. "He may imply that your interest in the ranch records is opportunistic. That you married Eli with knowledge of the fraud and intended to position yourself to benefit from exposing it. That would require me to have known about the fraud before I arrived, May said. Yes, it would. Hale almost smiled. I would like you to say something very close to what you just said to me, if and when he makes that argument. I can do that. I know. He gestured toward the courthouse doors. Let's go in. The courtroom was not large, but it was full. Judge Edmund Briggs' courtroom seated perhaps 60 people on its wooden benches, and by the time the clock on the wall read 5 minutes before 9, every bench was occupied, and several people were standing along the back wall. May recognized some of them August Cole from the bank, his face pale and carefully blank. 2 of the men from the feed store who had watched her count receipts with undisguised curiosity. A woman she had spoken to briefly at the well whose name she had not yet learned. Owen Kessler sat near the back with his hat in his hands. A large man in his mid-50s who had the sunburned, weathered look of someone who had been ranching these hills for 30 years and expected to be ranching them for 30 more. He did not look at Eli. He looked at the floor. Roland Voss sat at the plaintiff's table with Marcus Greer beside him. Greer was perhaps 50, with a gray beard trimmed very precisely and the expression of a man who had spent his career being underestimated in courtrooms and had learned to use that underestimation as a tool. Voss himself looked composed in a way that seemed to May slightly too studied. His hands were folded on the table. His posture was correct. He had the practiced calm of a man who had been in difficult situations before and was confident in his ability to talk his way out of them, which was, May thought, exactly the kind of confidence that made a particular type of person sloppy about evidence. Judge Edmund Briggs entered at 9 o'clock precisely. He was 62, a big man who had put on weight around the middle without putting it anywhere else, with a white mustache and the measured, unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by anyone else's urgency. He settled into his chair, adjusted his papers, looked out at the room for approximately 4 seconds and said, "Sit down." Everyone sat. Marcus Greer opened for the plaintiff. He had a good voice, deep measured with the cadence of someone who had learned early that juries and judges both respond to the appearance of calm certainty. He laid out Voss's position methodically. A legitimate business arrangement, 2 years of financial advisory services, rendered to Eli Danner, compensation duly recorded and received, and now a counterclaim filed by a woman who had been a resident of the Danner property for less than 4 weeks, and had, in Greer's words, developed a sudden and highly convenient interest in records that happened to support a narrative favorable to her current domestic position. May kept her face still while he said this. She had expected it. Hale had told her to expect it. She focused on the grain of the wooden table in front of her and let Greer's voice go past her like weather. Hale's opening was shorter and crisper. He named 3 things: the inflated feed receipts, the missing cattle entries, and the altered water rights boundary. He said the court would hear testimony supporting all 3 from documentary evidence and from witnesses. He sat down in approximately 4 minutes, which was, May noticed, considerably less time than Greer had used, and considerably more efficient. Judge Briggs looked at his papers. "Mr. Greer, call your first witness." Greer called Roland Voss. Voss took the stand with the ease of a man who had done this before. He described his arrangement with Eli Danner in smooth, practiced sentences. A consulting arrangement, fair market rate services, including supply chain negotiation and financial planning. He spoke about the water rights filing as a clerical matter, a survey that had simply not been updated in several years. He spoke about the cattle records as reflecting a difficult season of losses that any experienced rancher would understand. His voice was even and regretful in the way that voices are when someone has calculated that regret will play better than defensiveness. Harley cross-examined him for 31 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. He asked Voss to identify the line items in the feed receipts. He asked Voss to explain the specific per hundredweight pricing, which was 40% higher than the prevailing regional rate which Hale had obtained from 2 other suppliers in the county. He asked Voss to explain why the cattle loss records contain no documentation of sale, no veterinary records, and no correspondence with adjacent ranchers about disease spread. He asked Voss about the survey document and specifically about the date on the boundary notation, which was different from the date on the original survey filing by 11 months. Voss's answers grew more careful as the questions continued. He said he would have to review specific records. He said these were matters that his supplier contacts could address better than he could. He said the boundary question was a surveying matter and not his area of expertise. Hale let each answer land in the room without comment, which was more effective than commentary would have been. Greer called May next. She had expected to be called by Hale, and she realized, sitting down in the witness chair, that Greer was calling her specifically to establish the narrative he wanted: recent arrival, convenient interest, insufficient standing. She settled her hands in her lap and looked at him steadily. Greer started pleasantly enough. How long had she been in Coldwater Flats? How long had she known Eli Danner before the marriage? Had she been aware of any financial difficulties at the ranch before she arrived? She answered each question precisely. 3 weeks and 4 days. She had corresponded with Reverend Hollis, who had facilitated the introduction. She and Eli had exchanged 4 letters over 6 weeks. She had been told the ranch was operating under financial strain, as most ranches in the county were following 2 difficult seasons. Then Greer shifted. "Mrs. Danner," he said, and she noted that he used that name deliberately to emphasize how recently she had acquired it. "Isn't it true that within 48 hours of arriving at the Danner property, you began reviewing private financial records?" "Yes," May said, "before you were invited to do so. The ledger was on the kitchen shelf. It was not locked. I looked at it because the numbers in it concerned me." "Concerned you," Greer repeated, and he said it in a way designed to suggest that this was the behavior of someone with an ulterior motive. "You had been on the property less than 2 days, and you were already sufficiently concerned about the finances to begin a private investigation. I ran my late husband's livestock operation for 4 years after he died," May said. "I know what a healthy set of books looks like. I know what a compromised set of books looks like. I wasn't looking for problems to justify my presence. I found the truth because I was the first person in 3 years who bothered to compare the receipts to the ledger." The room was quiet. Greer looked at her for a moment. He had prepared for defensiveness, May thought, or for deflection. He had not quite prepared for this. He adjusted. "You have made serious allegations against Mr. Voss," he said. "Allegations of fraud, of deliberate manipulation of financial documents." "I have presented documents," May said. "The documents make the allegations. I simply read them and organized them, and arranged to have an attorney travel from Bozeman. I sent for a lawyer because I found evidence of fraud. That is what a person does when they find evidence of fraud. Mrs. Danner." Greer's voice sharpened slightly. "You are a widow. You arrived in this town with no property, no income, no established standing. You married a man you had corresponded with for 6 weeks. And now, less than a month later, you're in this courtroom attempting to overturn financial arrangements that have been in place for 2 years. I would suggest that a disinterested observer might find that sequence of events somewhat—" "A disinterested observer," May said. And she kept her voice level and clear, the voice she had used in her own kitchen when she had first laid the ledgers out and made herself read every number before she allowed herself to feel anything about them. "Would note that the ranch lost $4,000 in 3 years to inflated feed costs. They would note that 12 head of cattle appear in the tally records, but not in any sale or loss documentation. They would note that the water rights boundary on the county filing does not match the original survey by a 1/4 mile, and that this discrepancy benefits Mr. Voss's adjacent interest directly. A disinterested observer, Mr. Greer, would say that someone should have found these things 3 years ago. I found them in 11 days. I would suggest that the question you ought to be asking is not why I looked. The question is why no one else did." She heard the room shift. Not a sound, exactly a change in quality of attention, the way a crowd moves when something unexpected has happened that everyone recognizes as significant. Judge Briggs looked at Greer over his glasses. "Do you have additional questions for this witness, Mr. Greer?" Greer said he had no further questions. Haley stood up. He asked May 3 questions, each of which allowed her to clarify a specific point of the documentary evidence. She answered them clearly and sat down. Hale called August Cole August. Cole was 41. A careful man with thin hair and the expression of someone who had spent 2 decades trying to avoid being in the center of anything uncomfortable and had discovered too late that avoidance has its own costs. He sat in the witness chair with his hat in his hands, and his eyes moving between Hale and the floor. He confirmed the withdrawals. 5 separate transactions over 14 months, totaling $230, drawn against Eli Danner's account and made payable to Voss and Associates. He confirmed that a clerk had flagged one of these transactions 14 months ago as inconsistent with the account's stated management structure. He confirmed that he had reviewed the clerk's concern and had not acted on it. Hale asked him why. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Voss sent considerable business my way. New accounts, referrals. And you were concerned that questioning his arrangement with Mr. Danner might affect that relationship." "Yes." The room was very still. "Mr. Cole," Hale said, "when you reviewed the clerk's concern, did you believe the transaction was improper?" Another pause. Cole looked at his hat. "I thought it might be irregular," he said finally. "I told myself there was a satisfactory explanation that I simply hadn't been provided." "Did you ask for that explanation?" "No." "Thank you, Mr. Cole," Hale said. "No further questions." Greer declined to cross-examine. May thought this was a mistake. Cole's testimony had done real damage, and leaving it without any attempt at mitigation gave the room no alternative frame. But Greer had perhaps calculated that further questions would only extend the damage. Or perhaps he had already made the calculation that Voss was going to lose this and was protecting his own reputation for whatever came next. Hale called Owen Kessler. Kessler came to the stand with the slow, deliberate movement of a large man who does not like small spaces and likes being watched even less. He was 54, broader through the chest than he had probably been at 30, with a gray-streaked beard and hands that looked like they had been doing hard work for a very long time. He settled into the witness chair and looked at Hale with the careful expression of a man who had made a decision he wasn't sure he was glad about yet. Hale established who he was. Neighboring rancher, 22 years in the county, property on the eastern boundary of the county's water rights district. Then Hale asked him, "Mr. Kessler, are you familiar with the water rights boundary currently on file with County Clerk Silas Webb?" "I am," Kessler said. "And do you have any knowledge of when or how that boundary was altered from its original survey coordinates?" The room shifted again. Greer straightened in his chair. Voss's expression for the first time all morning became something other than composed. "I noticed a discrepancy," Kessler said in the voice of a man speaking carefully around something that had been sitting heavily on him for a while. "About 14 months ago, when I was pulling my own water rights documentation for a renewal filing." "What kind of discrepancy?" "The boundary line on the county file didn't match what I had in my own records from the original survey. It was shifted, about a quarter mile, in a way that moved a secondary draw from Danner's side of the line to the disputed middle." "What did you do with that information, Mr. Kessler?" Kessler's jaw moved. He looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked up at Hale. "Nothing," he said. "At the time, I thought it might be a surveying error, and then—" He stopped. "Mr. Voss had done some work for me, 2 seasons prior. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, and I let it sit." "Did you subsequently develop a view about what you had been looking at?" "Yes." Kessler's voice was flat. "Over the following months. Yes. I came to believe it wasn't an error, but you didn't come forward." "No." He said it simply without excuse. "I didn't come forward. I should have. I didn't." May watched Eli from across the room. He had not looked at Kessler since the man sat down. Now he was looking at the table, and his face was doing something complicated and controlled, the face of a man who has learned that the people you thought might help you sometimes have their reasons for not doing it. Hale asked Kessler to describe the specific boundary discrepancy in detail, which he did, matching it point by point with the county document Hale introduced into evidence. Greer cross-examined briefly, and without effect, Kessler had no financial motive to testify. No relationship with May, and 14 months of sitting with this particular guilt had made him paradoxically a very credible witness. The guilt itself was testimony. Judge Briggs took 35 minutes. He did not leave the courtroom. He sat at his bench with the documents spread before him, the original survey, the county file, the annotated receipts, the bank records. Hale's summary of the ledger discrepancies, and he read through them with the methodical pace of a man who had been reading legal documents for 30 years and had no intention of being hurried through these ones. The room waited. May sat with her hands folded on the table. She was not watching the judge. She was looking at the window above the back benches, which showed a rectangle of pale Montana sky, cloudless and high, and very far away. She thought about the kitchen in the mornings, and the sound the creek made when there was enough water in it, and the way the ledger had looked on the shelf the first time she noticed it. Just a book, just numbers, just the ordinary evidence of how things had been going. Eli sat beside her, without touching her. But she was aware of him, the particular quality of his stillness, the way a person who has spent years learning to compensate for one kind of imbalance develops a stillness in everything else that is something other than calm. It is the stillness of someone who is paying complete attention to everything at once. Judge Briggs set down the last document. "In the matter of the water rights filing," he said in a voice calibrated for the size of the room and nothing larger, "the evidence before this court establishes to a reasonable degree of certainty that the county filing does not reflect the original survey coordinates and that the discrepancy benefits interests other than those of the registered holder Eli Danner. The court orders restoration of the original boundary as established by survey. The clerk's office will be instructed to amend the county record accordingly." He paused and looked at his papers. "In the matter of the financial arrangements between Roland Voss and Eli Danner, the documentary evidence presented suggests irregularities in billing and account management and in the records of livestock disposition that exceed what could reasonably be attributed to clerical error or seasonal misfortune. The court finds sufficient cause to refer this matter to the district attorney's office for further investigation." He looked up. "Mr. Voss, you are not to leave the county without notifying this court. Mr. Greer, I expect you will communicate that instruction to your client clearly." Greer said he would. "The counterclaim by Danner is sustained on the question of water rights. The financial matter is referred not resolved. That will take longer and more process than this proceeding allows. But I want to be clear." Briggs looked out at the courtroom, at the full benches and the standing figures along the back wall. "What has been presented here today is the result of careful, methodical work. The evidence was found documented and brought before this court in proper form. That is how the law is supposed to work." He paused. "Court is adjourned." He stood. The room stood. May put her hands flat on the table and let herself take one breath that was different from the other breaths she had taken that morning. The aftermath was not quiet, though it was not loud either. It was the particular controlled noise of a room full of people who all have something to say to each other and are trying to determine who should go first. Hale shook her hand, and then Eli's. He was already thinking about the next phase, the district attorney referral. The bank's probable cooperation given Cole's testimony, the timeline for recovering the inflated fees. He would be back in Bozeman by evening and would write to them within the week. May thanked him with the directness he seemed to respond to better than any other register. 2 ranchers she did not know came forward. One of them, a quiet man named Garrett, who ran cattle east of Kessler's property, said he had seen Voss's pricing on his own supply contracts and had always thought something was wrong, but hadn't known how to prove it. The other man barely spoke. He just put his hat back on and shook Eli's hand and walked out, which told May more than most speeches would have. Owen Kessler crossed the room. He stopped in front of Eli and did not say anything for a moment. He held his hat in both hands. He was not a man who would have found this easy, May thought, and she also thought that the fact that he was doing it anyway meant something. "I should have said something sooner," Kessler said. Eli looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "You should have." Kessler nodded. He had probably expected that and deserved it. "If there's anything I can do for the water situation in the meantime—" "There isn't," Eli said, "but I appreciate it." Kessler nodded again. He looked briefly at May, and in his look was something she recognized, the particular expression of a man who has just seen someone do something he could have done and didn't, and is trying to work out how to live with that going forward. He would work it out, she thought. Men like Kessler usually did. It just took them longer than it should. He put his hat on and left. Harriet Bloom appeared at May's elbow as if she had been there for a while, and May simply hadn't noticed her. She probably had been. Harriet Bloom seemed to be the kind of woman who positioned herself deliberately and waited for the right moment. "My sister's husband runs a feed operation out of Great Falls," Harriet said without preamble. "Fair prices, doesn't overweight his invoices." She pressed a small folded piece of paper into May's hand. "That's his address. He's reliable." May looked at the paper. She looked at Harriet. "Thank you." Harriet's expression shifted very slightly in the direction of something warmer, though it did not fully arrive there. "You did good work," she said. "People noticed." She nodded once in the precise and deliberate way she had nodded that morning outside the store and walked away. They rode home in the early afternoon. The sky had changed while they were inside. There were clouds building in the northwest high, and gray-bottomed, moving slowly, but with the particular weight that meant they were carrying something. May had grown up in country that changed fast, and she had learned to read the sky the way other people read faces. They rode for a while without talking. The horses knew the way, and the road back to the ranch curved through a long stretch of grass that was brown from the dry summer. And the fence lines ran beside it with their familiar geometry of wood and wire, and above everything the clouds moved and the light changed under them in slow, sweeping patterns across the hills. "Greer called you Mrs. Danner," Eli said finally. "He did." "You didn't correct him." May looked at the road ahead. "No, I didn't." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about the sign." "The sign at the gate. It just says Danner. It's been that way since I put it up in—" He paused, doing the arithmetic. 81. 8 years ago. He looked at the road the way he sometimes looked at things when he was working through a decision he had already made but wanted to say out loud anyway to confirm the shape of it. "I thought I might have Beckett make a new one. Pine-burned letters, Danner and Collier." May did not say anything for a moment. "Collier is my name," she said, "not my husband's." "I know whose name it is." She looked at him. He was watching the road, his jaw set in the particular way it set when he had said something true and was not going to take it back. "All right," May said. They rode the rest of the way home with the clouds building behind them and the light going soft and complex under them, and when the gate came into view at the end of the road, May looked at it. The weathered post, the old board with its faded single word, and thought about what it would look like with 2 names on it instead of 1, and what it meant that a man she had known for less than a month had decided without her asking that both names belonged there. Beckett made the sign that weekend. He worked in the yard for most of a Saturday afternoon. The smell of burning pine sharp and clean in the air, and when he carried it to the gate post and lifted it into place, he had burned the letters with more care than anyone had asked for. They were even and deep and would hold their shape through years of weather. Danner and Collier Ranch. He stood back and looked at it with the critical expression of someone assessing their own craftsmanship, found it acceptable, and then noticed that May was watching from the porch and turned red from the collar up, which was his response to being observed, doing anything he cared about. "It's good work, Beckett," May said. He turned redder and went to find something to do in the barn. Orville appeared from somewhere and looked at the sign for a long moment. Then he said, "2 names is better," in the tone of someone delivering a considered philosophical position. No one had asked him. He delivered it anyway and wandered off. Gideon walked past, glanced at the sign, and went back to work without comment. But May noticed when she looked toward the barn a few minutes later that he had stopped in the doorway and was looking at the gate with an expression that on Gideon was the equivalent of a long speech. The fall cattle drive went out in the first week of October. 12 days. Eli rode with the hands he had always ridden the drives regardless of the leg, and he was not going to stop now because things had been difficult. May managed the ranch in his absence, which was not a new skill for her, but was a new application of it. She dealt with a fence repair, a sick cow that recovered a dispute with a neighbor about a shared water trough that she resolved in 40 minutes with 2 sentences and a surveying map she had already pulled from the county records. The drive came back on a Wednesday. Eli came through the gate in the late afternoon, trail dirty and tired, in the way that was different from unhappy, the tiredness of someone who has done exactly what they set out to do. He gave her the numbers in the kitchen sitting at the table while she made coffee. Best return in 4 years. Not dramatic, not a reversal of everything. But the best return in 4 years, which was enough to cover the outstanding notes, bring the operational accounts out of deficit, and leave a margin that, if the winter was not catastrophic, would carry them to spring. May opened the ledger that evening. She sat at the kitchen table after supper and went through the numbers with the same care she had used on the first night when she had been looking for what was wrong. Now she was looking at what was right. The feed costs were lower. Harriet's brother-in-law in Great Falls charged fair prices and invoiced what he delivered. The cattle numbers were accounted for every head, every transaction. The water had come back when the gate was restored, and the south pasture had recovered enough to support 20 more head through the fall. She closed the ledger. It was positive. For the first time in 3 years, the ledger was positive. She put her hand on the cover for a moment, which she had not expected to do and which she did not entirely explain to herself. It was not sentimentality. It was something closer to recognition, the recognition of a thing that had been wrong for a long time and was now in this one narrow column of numbers beginning to move in the other direction. She heard Eli's step in the hallway. The particular sound of it, the slight uneven cadence she had learned in the first days without thinking about it, the same way you learn the particular sound of a house's settling in the night and stop hearing it as something wrong. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Ledger," he said. "Positive," she said. He nodded. He had expected this or hoped for it hard enough that it had the quality of expectation. He came to the table and sat down across from her, and he did not look at the ledger. He looked at her. There was a quality to his looking that she had been aware of for a while, since before the trial. Since somewhere in the middle of those 11 days when they had been working together in the particular way that people work together when the stakes are real and time is short and they discover not entirely comfortably that the other person is exactly as capable as the situation requires. She had been aware of it and had set it to the side because there were other things to attend to. Now there were not. "I want to say something," Eli said. She waited. "I married you because I needed help." He said it plainly without apology, the way he said everything he meant. "That was the arrangement. I knew it and you knew it, and we were honest about it from the start, which I think is more than most people manage." He paused. "But I've been sitting with something for a few weeks now, and I think if I don't say it out loud, I'll carry it around until it gets in the way of everything else, and that seems like a waste." "Say it then," May said. "I'm glad it was you." He met her eyes and held them. Not glad it was someone, glad the circumstance worked out. Glad it was you specifically. The way you read those books. The way you went to Webb's office alone because you knew it had to be done that way. The way you sat in that courtroom and didn't ask anyone to feel sorry for you. I was watching all of that." He stopped. His jaw was set, but his eyes were not guarded in the way they usually were. "I'd like us to stay married because we've decided to, not because it was the arrangement. I'd like you to decide that with me, if you want to." May looked at him across the table, across the closed ledger, and the lamp between them, and the 3 weeks and 4 years, and everything she had come from, and everything that was beginning to look like something she might be going toward. She had not expected to feel this way about anything in a long time. She had thought after her first husband died that she had used up the particular kind of hope that made this feeling possible. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about several things she was finding, as it turned out. "I want to," she said. He nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he had believed but needed to hear. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen in the lamplight, while outside the night went on being dark and the cattle settled in the pasture, and the new sign at the gate held its burned letters against the October wind. The rain came the last week of October. It had not rained in Coldwater Flats since early July. 3 months of dry sky had done what 3 months of dry sky always does. Browned the grass, cracked the creek beds, tightened everyone's tempers in proportion to their worry. Even with the water gate restored and the secondary draw running again, the land had been carrying the weight of the summer like a man carrying something too heavy for too long. The clouds came in from the northwest in the late afternoon, the same direction they had been building all day, and the first drops fell at supper time. Fat, slow drops that landed on the dry ground and left dark circles that held their shape for a moment before they disappeared. Then more drops. Then more. And then the rain arrived in earnest, the kind of rain that comes after a long absence and does not apologize for how long it took. Beckett was the first one outside. May heard him shout something from the direction of the barn and looked out the window to see him standing in the yard, with his arms out and his face up, rain falling on his red hair and his freckled neck grinning with the uncomplicated joy of someone who is 17 and the drought is over. And it does not occur to him not to stand in the rain and let it fall on him. Gideon came out of the barn and stood in the doorway with his arms folded and watched the rain fall. He stood like that for a long time, the way he stood when he was satisfied by something but was not going to comment on it. His face had in its most restrained form something that might have been a smile. It was close enough. Orville climbed the fence post by the gate. He climbed up and sat on top of it in the rain with his hat off, looking out at the pasture where the grass would in a few days begin the slow work of becoming green again. He turned around after a minute and shouted something back toward the house. May couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the rain fall on the yard, on the new sign at the gate on the pasture, and the fence lines, and the barn, and the hills that went up and away to the north, where the first real cold of the year was probably already building. Eli came to stand beside her at the window, and they watched together without talking, the way you watch things that have been needed for a long time and have finally simply come. May Collier had come to Coldwater Flats with nothing but the truth in her hands and the will to use it. She had never been worthless. She had only been waiting for a life courageous enough to deserve her.